Yeah, I mean, one of the things about unit testing when you start getting into it is that you realize the way that you used to write code, you don't write it the same way anymore. You've got to completely change things around just so that you can inject here and overwrite this and mock this and do that. And so the way that you would typically write something is different. So you're sitting there having all these little bitty functions kind of all over the place so that you can override them so that when you run another test, you can kind of inject the right data or the right result that you're trying to test for. And that's kind of the way that we do it in the development area. We really don't have those mechanisms inside of a query to do that, right? I can't say, oh, when you look for this table, override and go look, point to this table instead, which has all this proper data in it. We don't have that, and that's the fundamental problem of unit testing with SQL Server is that when you have this query, I need to have all this set of data and have an expected result for it. And if I'm pointing to a DMV, I can't really say point to another table where it has the right data in it, and that's the problem.
Did you ever look at tSQLt, the open source unit testing framework?
Yeah, I hated it.
And what did you hate about it? I had similar feelings, but yeah.
It was just very clunky. It was just very clunky to run and get going, and there was a lot of steps to get it going. And after about a day or two of that, I just said something else, right? I mean, we'll approach this from a different angle than jumping through the tSQLt. Now people use it and they like it, and that's great. But I like simplicity in my tools, and I don't have to go through a bunch of hoops. So that way, when I go back to it in 6 months, I'm not relearning the same things again. So those are the type of things. One of those things that are super simple is the serverless project, right? Where the serverless project, it helps you write or deploy and install Lambda functions. And all I have is a YAML file that says what to do, and it's done. And I write serverless install, and it installs it all the way up to the cloud, and it's a wonderful thing. I go back to that in 6 months, I can understand what that YAML file does. tSQLt, that's not, now I got to do this runtime and I got to do all this other stuff, and it's just like, it's not a command line thing. It's just not simple. And I think it's probably because the problem isn't simple. It's a complex thing. I've been on some projects where they wrote their own kind of unit testing for SQL Server stuff, and it was just a bunch of load this data here, run it, here's an expected result. And it was just a bunch of load and check, and it was simple. It was a simple thing to do, but it was a lot of hard work because you had to load all that data in, get a result, and then keep going, right? And just everything you had to do, you had to write all your own data for. And when you got into those more complex queries, things got a little rough.
That's just, the tSQLt playing around that I did, I was shocked that I'm like, wait a minute, it's going to drop tables or rename tables and substitute in tables with known sets of data. I'm like, man, that's good. That's tough.
Yeah,
that's for every single query because my tables keep changing. I can imagine an environment where it works, where your tables are super mature, where they never change. You want to be able to develop on your desktop, 50 different developers developing on their desktops and know that their changes are going to work when you merge them all in. But on something where it's rapidly changing, that was a tough sell.
Yeah. Yeah, which we should also be working on our own databases anyway, frankly, but that gets a lot harder in the cloud.
Yeah, we face some of these problems when we tune queries for clients. So like Tara's been working on a query tuning project, and it's even hard. Imagine that somebody brings you, say, I'm just picking a number, 1,000 line stored procedure, and it's got lots of different branches in there. It takes different parameters, so different parameters trigger different parts of code. If you go tune it, how do you know that it even produces the same results before and after? Like you have to have the original version of the code, the new version of the code. You need to dump both the sets of data into temp tables with all kinds of different parameters, make sure that they return the same number of rows. It's pretty hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of the unit testing tools there help with all that stuff when you're talking about code, but and it's really easy to do. All I do is install a package and off I go. And it's that's it. I just start a new file and it's just code. It's the same thing that I'm writing before. I'm just testing my code with code. And typically what I found as I'm writing this unit test stuff, I get about 3 times more code of unit tests than I do of my regular code. So, and I figure that 3-to-1 is probably, it works well for me. Some people don't, you know, say more or less, but sometimes you have to write a lot of setup for that stuff. But once you get going and you're like, okay, now I'm running, I'm in that testing mindset, what needs to go, it usually runs pretty quickly. And now I have reliability that, hey, I know things will work, and when things don't work, everybody knows because it's in the build system. And oh, look, who broke the build, and someone could go in and fix it. Usually. That hasn't happened today yet, so that's good. Happened yesterday.
Oh God, my bugs. All right, we'll get started with the questions. Folks, if you have any technical questions about SQL Server, consulting, whatever, the cloud, feel free to ask them in over in the questions pane and go to webinar. We'll start with Rowdy. Hello, Rowdy. Says, hi, folks. I'm migrating off a well-designed, he's only saying that because he doesn't want to insult his predecessor, but ancient availability group. It's SQL 2012 on Windows 2008 R2. It's new hardware and a new OS, but unfortunately it won't involve a SQL Server version change. He says, is there any tools that you'd use to check to make sure that all the settings and users and jobs are identical in the new availability group before cutting over?
Well, knowing Rowdy, I'm surprised that he hasn't stumbled on DBA tools for that, because I know that they have instance comparison functions for SQL Server. I'd be surprised because I know he's a PowerShell guy.
Mm-hmm. And we, Erik and I were talking a lot about this as part of the faux pas project, the thing that we're doing of kind of now, these days it's log shipping at scale, but for a while we were talking about building availability groups at scale. And the idea was, could we conceptually script out all of the contents of a server, like all the metadata, trace flags, SP configure settings, dump all that out into one file, and then use it to import again into another one? It's not out there. Like, the functionality to do it just isn't there. There's nothing to compare two servers identically. The closest two things that I've seen have been a Redgate schema compare. We'll check and see the differences between DMVs if you want it to, but of course it's going to produce all kinds of false positives that are just garbage, you know, false change differences that are just garbage. Or Kendall Van Dyke wrote this SQL Power Doc that dumps out a lot of configuration into Excel. It's built atop PowerShell. Kendall hasn't maintained it for at least a year or two. He went to work for Microsoft and just stopped working on the project.
So people get busy at Microsoft, Brent. Come on now.
Right? I actually wrote a blog post about that this morning. It's very funny how that works. But yeah, so that's a way you could go down and start, but I haven't seen anything that catches all the trace flags, SP configure settings, master database objects.
I don't even think like there's a good framework for it.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I had to do it from a purely tSQL point of view, I can see creating a linked server, creating synonyms to all the DMVs that point to the other server, and then just doing like an intersect or accept query that would catch things that are different between the two. And even that's a nightmare, because I would miss something. I would miss lots of things.
And even that, we're talking about just differencing scripts. We're not even talking about application either. You'd want to apply the differences too, and that's even harder. Rowdy says, I have found dbatools.io. So you know what I would do is dbatools.io has a super lively participation group in Slack. I would ask over there, because I'm sure that they don't have an answer either, but I bet that they know, people who would be interested in building that kind of thing, just long term. Let's see, next up, Hannah says, is there any reason that I should want to keep duplicate indexes? I'm a junior DBA at a new software development company. I'm only working with developers, and I'm the only DBA. They create stuff no one else has ever gone back to review or maintain. We have thousands of duplicate indexes in an instance, some because of uniqueness, some clustered with non-clustered indexes, some because there was a typo. So is there any reason I should keep those?
She mentioned a couple of the reasons that I think would be good if they were enforcing referential integrity or uniqueness. If they were like backing up a foreign key or something. But exact duplicates where, you see one has, all the reads and the same amount of writes as another one that has none of the reads, and I would just start disabling those.
There's one gotcha, which is if some developer has named the index in an index hint, their query will simply break. It won't adapt and use another identical index. It will simply not work. I look at that as a benefit because you shouldn't be hard coding index names inside your queries. So just if you do it, disable the indexes rather than drop them. The only reason I say that is because then that way if someone comes running in and says, my queries are all failing, then you can do an alter index rebuild and it's hydrated back up in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, I love that problem because, us devs, we take a look at it and we run in a query and all of a sudden says, hey, you may be missing this index. And then we're like, oh, okay, yeah, let's go ahead and throw that on there. Let's throw that shrimp on the Barbie. I don't know what it does. We'll just go ahead and do it. And sure enough, it probably was there already. It just didn't use it at that point. And there we go. Duplicate, 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 duplicate.
Now you have 40 indexes called name of missing index, this name.
So I go to a client and go on site, and I'm in the room with the DBA. They're having all these performance problems, and there's nobody in there, just me and the DBA. And one of the things I run is SQLt index, and we're looking at it, and one of the tables has 174 identical missing indexes. 174 indexes, not like on different tables, 174 on the same table. So you try to keep the poker face as a consultant, and I'm like, hey, so what's up with this? Can you tell me a little bit about, where we got to these 174 indexes? And the developer says, well, when someone brings me a slow query, I go look at it, I figure out, it says indexes are recommended, and then I go and add those indexes. Again, I'm trying to keep the poker face. And I'm like, well, but all these are identical. He says, yeah, he says, it always recommends that I create an index, but that the name already exists. I just figured it's the name because he's using tools like the DTA and the missing indexes.
Oh, God.
He would just put ASDF, bang on his keyboard at the end of the index name to give himself a name. I said, okay. I said, so where are you doing this at? Where are you doing your index tuning? And he says, oh, I'm doing it over in development. I know better than to do it over on the production environment. And I said, well, when was the last time you refreshed development from the production environment? When was the last time you restored it over? And he stopped and thought, and he goes, I don't think I ever have. So the poor guy was repeatedly recreating exactly the same index because it was missing in dev and never actually bringing it over from production. You'd be amazed at what you see out there. And the good part was, I said, look, now I'm explaining to you what's going wrong. It's just you and me in this room. So what we're going to do is drop 173 of these indexes, and we're going to go back and tell your boss that we found the magic go faster button, and everyone's just going to love you to death. And they did. Everybody learns somehow. Matt says, I've been tasked with putting Reporting Services 2016 on an availability group. Is there anything I need to watch out for or know before I do this? Ooh, I would ask this as two questions. Or Matt, let me ask a follow-up. Is this your first availability group? Because that may influence what our answers are. Next up, Graham says, I'm troubleshooting entity framework generated SQL queries. Is there a methodology or a tool that I could use to make this easier? I've suggested that the developer start using LinkPad, but is there something else?
I guess that's my question, right?
I think so, yeah.
There are a couple monitoring tools out there. I can't think of them at the top of my head right now.
Ants. Redgate Ants. Just kidding.
Well, Ants is for memory. And some other stuff. So if you're running through it, the code, it will give you times like right in your code, and you're debugging it. Hey, how long this ran and how long that ran. If you're dealing with a specific entity framework problem, it's not going to tell you that what the query was or anything like that. It's just going to tell you that this function that you ran in 30 seconds. And then it will tell you that probably the query in itself ran for 29 seconds or whatever that is. That's what Ants will give you. I love Ants. I think Ants is a great product. But there's a couple of entity framework tools, and it depends if you're using Core versus Entity Framework 6. They're essentially different products that you could go and you can actually kind of monitor stuff. I've used them. If I needed to do an EF thing right now, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably just go into Dev, run Profiler, and start grabbing some of the queries from there and just start tuning from that stuff. Probably actually run SQL Indexer or something and start taking a look at the indexes, because that's probably what it is. That's where I go first, and then I start looking at the queries themselves and see what's going on inside of them. Blitz cache is one other good one for that. If I start taking a look at, hey, what's going on inside of the cache and where my queries are and how long things are running. That's probably where I would start. But there are some monitoring tools out there you could use for any framework to kind of see what's going on inside and what's taking so long. It's probably some really complex queries that's generating some suboptimal SQL, and you probably just need to either back away from that and use a stored procedure, or kind of figure out what exactly data you need in that query.
Let's see, Matt says a follow-up. He says, I already have a 2016 availability group for a production website, and this will just be on the same group of servers, but on a different AG. Yeah, in that case, I don't think we've got anything since we don't do reporting services work. I would just read the books online, stuff on adding availability groups in for reporting services, because I want to say that there's some gotchas there. But we don't do a whole lot of that, so you got me there. Gordon says, I'm somewhat confused as to the minimum number of cluster nodes that need to be online for the cluster to still be up. And he's got a whole bunch of information down there about his specific scenarios. He's got 2 nodes and a file share witness with dynamic quorum enabled. What happens if I lose one node? What happens if I lose another? Now, unfortunately, this is beyond the scope of what I can answer fast. I actually have a whole 30-minute session on it in the senior DBA class where I walk through the problems with dynamic quorum and dynamic witness. In theory, if you're lucky and the right node owns the vote at the time, you can get all the way down to last man standing. If you're unlucky in a 2-node plus witness configuration and the wrong node goes down, then you can't get down to last man standing. So that's why things are a little bit tricky there in terms of the articles you'll see out there. Some of them just assume that the right node happens to own the vote. Some of them explain that if you don't have the right node owning the vote, you go down hard. Dawn asks, I have a query that's joining a view, then joining a table to add another column that probably should have been added in the view. Performance is terrible. Is there a known issue with joining views and tables?
No, there's not a known issue with views and tables, but if those views call other views, like if you have nested views, you could end up with a whole weird thing. What I would want to do is start with the query plan for that. And I would want to start taking a look at that to see if there's anything obvious jumping out at me there for why this might be so god-awful slow. If you're joining just to add one column in, now I know this is going to sound weird and hand-wavy, but every time there's been a case with me as a DBA where a developer's just like, I'm just going to add this one column in. 2 days later, this query is still running with like this awful key lookup, and I'm sitting there like, yeah, you just added that one column in. Thanks, boss. Save the day.
Yeah, I love the whole views or on views things, because as a developer, that's kind of what you want to build, right? Mm-hmm. Hey, I've got this one little piece of code and I'm going to build it on top of that. And now I have this, flexibility. So if something changes here, it automatically goes up here. And yeah, and then I start, nesting all these views, and it makes great sense, right? From a developer's perspective, but from performance, man, it's just dog. It is terrible. You just don't even do it. Don't even think about it.
I'd really want to get the difference too between the query that the view produces on its own versus the query that it produces when it's joined to the other table, because that could also give you some unique insight into what's changing underneath.
It can be, and judging that you're asking this question too, what you probably want next is help from someone looking at the views or looking at the execution plans. And this is why we made pastetheplan.com. And by we, I mean Richie. So pastetheplan.com is where you can go paste in execution plans on our site, and then they're uploaded and shared with the public. Now, the first thing you need to know is these are now public execution plans. Anyone can see them. So if you have stuff in there that the company's kind of ashamed of, or social security numbers, credit card numbers, you probably don't want to paste the plan there. If it's totally public and you don't mind sharing them, then put both of those 2 execution plans on there, upload both of them, and then go to dba.stackexchange.com. And at dba.stackexchange.com, you can ask questions about SQL Server that span multiple paragraphs, include the links to paste the plan, and people will go through and look at those differences. If your query plans are private, or you're not supposed to show any of that data, go get SQL Sentry Plan Explorer. The SQL Sentry One, God, that company.
Rebranding.
So they're going to be cursed with this for years. SentryOne's Plan Explorer is totally free, and one of the features that it has is the ability to anonymize your plan. So it takes your execution plan, replaces all the tables with object 1, object 2, object 3. Now from there, you can take that execution plan and post it on Paste the Plan. But here's the thing, you don't want to bother doing that because no one wants to read your hideous execution plan once it says things like object 1, object 2, field 1, field 2. So instead, at the top of SentryOne's Plan Explorer, there's a button that says Post to SQLperformance.com. This is where people, smart people like Paul White and Aaron Bertrand, are sitting around waiting for your execution plans. And because they're paid to do it, they are much more likely to look at that heinously ugly execution plan through object 1, object 2, object 3. They can give you advice, but know that their advice is going to be things like, you should join object 3 field 60 to object 2 field 11 in order to improve your cardinality, and it just won't be as easy as having someone look at the real plan.
And to be fair, they are also sitting around doing the same thing on dba.stackexchange.com for free, so the advice is way worse. Because it's free, so you just really can't ask for a refund on that. But true. I'm
Kelly
kidding.
says,
Paul gives great answers for free.
I don't know what is
Great answers. It's
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, I need to I need to clear my mind, do some yoga, read it, go do some more yoga, meditate on what he just wrote. Yeah.
I have read whole book chapters that are easier to get through than one of Paul White's Stack Exchange answers.
But you also learned less.
By far, yeah. Whenever I see Paul White has a new answer that's like more than a page long, or he posts a blog post, I'm like, all right, let me clear out a spot of my calendar here because I'm going to need to focus for a while.
Brent's hitting the print button.
Can I bring this with me to the plane? Yeah. Kelly asks,
got 4 different color pens, and writing notes on it.
I find stickers to be really helpful. Stickers with little arrows, maybe a unicorn for the good parts. Yeah.
I hired some paralegals to just go through and make sure that everything is cited and annotated and just headers and footers on all these things. I don't feel dumb.
Yeah. I still feel dumb when I finish, but now I feel smart and dumb. Kelly says, I have one SQL Server instance, 2012 Service Pack 1. Well, first off, you should get on a supported Service Pack because that's not even supported anymore, where the optimizer accumulates and holds memory over time, maybe weeks, until there's very little memory available for database caching. I'm seeing this via Idera SQL Diagnostic Manager. When I restart the instance, that resolves it, but then it just restarts again, accumulating more cached plans. What should I do?
Stop restarting your SQLs, for instance. So that sounds like a pretty natural way that SQL Server works to me, is over time you read more things into memory and all of a sudden you're fully cached, or at least you have as much stuff cached as you can fit into memory. I'd probably want to, Brent has a good article on that. It's called the sysadmin guide to SQL Server memory.
That's true. Yeah,
that's true. He does have that. I think, I think that sounds like about the tree you're barking up, where SQL Server keeps using more and more memory, and you don't like it.
I wonder if, when you say that SQL Server has little memory available to cache data, I would question what's the problem there. Are you seeing page I/O latch waits? Page I/O latch waits means that SQL Server has to go out to storage in order to pull disk data back, and it's waiting for that. If you're looking at page life expectancy and going, this is way too low, I have a problem, don't do that. That's not the real problem there. I'm going to give you a truly horrible answer too. If you wanted to reduce the amount of memory used to cache execution plans, is anybody looking, you could run DBCC free proc cache, which will clear out all the execution plans stored in memory. This is a spectacularly bad idea. But if you were determined to do bad things, that would be a bad thing that you could do.
Yeah, also I'd be concerned about what Idera Diagnostic Manager is telling me, because SQL will only reserve so much space available for caching query plans, and it will evict those plans quite frequently. You see all sorts of memory pressure stuff coming in. So I guess what I would be concerned about is I have a query that's asking for a gigantic memory grant that's clearing out the buffer cache and the plan cache, but Still, SQL is pretty aggressive about the way it chooses to cache data, where it, points to, it'll want to cache data for queries that are going to read stuff versus where it's going to cache data for, or cache stuff like execution plans or DMB info or other things like that.
Brian Maynard also says maybe check ad hoc plans and use Optimize for ad hoc. Yeah, and that'll reduce the issue. I would just kick back and go, maybe I don't think it's really an issue at all.
Right. The answer is, what's the problem?
Tammy says, hi. Hello, Tammy. I have a SQL Server 2014 development instance. When I run CheckDB on a 25 gig database, it uses up most of the memory, then crashes the virtual server and requires a reboot. First, I would step back right there and go, anytime something crashes, that's probably not a SQL Server bug. There's probably something else going on, or even a SQL Server workload issue. The crash, I might even think about opening up a support call with Microsoft, because a crash shouldn't happen regardless. But she goes on and says, the server has a 16 gigs of memory and about 13 gigs of it is allocated to SQL Server. If I reduce the allocated memory a little bit, it doesn't crash. Does it seem right that DBCC should be able to cause this issue, and is it a bug?
So the answer is yes, and I actually dealt with this at my last real job, where I had a server with 512 gigs of memory, and when I had max server memory set to 485 gigs, DBCC CHECKDB on a 4.5 terabyte database would crash the server.
No.
When I set it to 475 gigs, it would run fine.
Get out of here, because it got a different memory grant based off that, or?
I think, honestly, I don't know what it was. I didn't have the memory grant saved from one to the other, but I just tell you that 10 gigs of max memory changed everything. I want to say that Windows just hit some breaking point where it was just like, I can't manage this, and quit, and that was it. Because it wasn't SQL Server crashing, it was Windows booting.
So Windows rage quit. Is that what you're trying to say?
Basically.
Yeah. So Tammy says, she says, if I set it to 12.2 gigs, it doesn't crash. The one thing I would say, there's two things I would say. Make sure you're fully patched, because there was a known bug around DBCC memory grants, around CheckDB's memory grants.
That's old.
The other thing I would say is, this is a laptop from 2012, circa 2012. It has 16 gigs of RAM on it. I don't know that a VM with 16 gigs of RAM, I don't know that I would go troubleshooting that much further if you're having memory issues. I would go add RAM. And if you're really hard up, I'll loan you some at a conference, because this isn't even a recent laptop.
Yeah, 2013, 32. Yeah.
The one on my desk, 32. The one under my desk, 128.
Yeah. We just had somebody with this
my
morning.
Tablet, 16.
My phone, 128. No, that's SSD. My thumbnail, a micro SSD card.
My water bottle.
In my pants. Marcy says, SQL Server transactional replication is so freaking hard to understand. Are there any good websites to decode it for troubleshooting?
TaraKaiser.com.
I don't even know if she owns that. TaraKaiser.com.
No,
Well, I do now. Ha.
If we weren't on a camera, I would totally go buy that. I would just call Microsoft in terms of support. There are a couple of good books on Amazon. Hillary Cotter had a book. I want to say Kendall Van Dyke had a book on it as well.
There's a free one from like Redgate or something.
Yeah.
Like Understanding Transactional Replication, I want to say. I started to read it like 2-3 years ago, because I said, I'm going to put my nose to the grindstone and learn about replication, because customers keep asking. And then I got like 3 pages in and said, I'm not learning about transactional replication. You're going to hear about something else instead.
It's really funny. The people who wrote those books even have all gone on to other things in their career. And there was a while there where one of the authors was emailing us and going, can you please take all replication consulting from me going forward? I was like, nope, not interested. Matt says, I have a server that's got 32 gigs of RAM, like both of the laptops we just saw. SQL Server is configured to use 24 gigs of RAM. When it starts, it consumes all 24 gigs. Is there a better way to configure memory for SQL Server? Is there a way to not have it consume all 24 gigs when it starts?
Why would you not?
I don't know. I'm just the questioner here. Maybe he wants to save it for later. It's like when I get a big Wishbone Cafe down here in Chicago. I want to say
you could set max memory lower and then slowly increase it as it's up longer. But I wouldn't.
That's cool.
Yeah, maybe you could set an alarm for every hour that you could actually, every time it's up, you could increase it 10 megs.
Oh, or get one of those like bird things that goes like this and just hits F5. So like every once in a while it'll increase max memory.
Ooh, maybe you should write a PowerShell script to do that, Erik.
Yeah, I'll get right on that. Yeah. And I'll see you guys in 2 years.
I would say if you're, you may check to see if you're using any trace flags or if you're using lock pages in memory. There was one trace flag that involved enabling large pages. I want to say for some reason it was 834. I can't quite remember. And which causes you to allocate all memory on startup, which is by design.
And could cause slow startup on servers with a lot of RAM. But Matt, you are not in that danger zone.
Tammy, who had the 16 gigs of memory, says, I'm being memory shamed. Hey, listen, it was much worse on my call this morning when somebody had a 1 terabyte database and had 80 gigs of RAM. And I was like, look, here's the deal. My desktop has 64. Erik is showing pictures of his desktop with 128. Tishal points out that the free book that Erik mentioned is called Fundamentals of SQL Server 2012 Replication.
There it is. Written by Tishal.
Written by Tishal. By all means, even though it says SQL Server 2012, it's still good for 2014, 2016, and 2017 because Microsoft hasn't put 1 peso of development into improving those features.
Me either.
Me neither. Kelly says, following up on her Idera SQL Diagnostic Manager and Plans question, she says, following up, most of the memory gets pinned to the optimizer, 28 gigs, free proc cache has no effect, and ad hoc is enabled. We're hitting the end of the call, but the thing that I would dig into for follow-up, because you could post this to Stack Exchange if you wanted. This is a great place for that. Also include the total amount of memory on the server and the total database size. If you look at SP Blitz, there's an output type for Markdown. Markdown is the question format that Stack Exchange uses. Google for SP Blitz Markdown, and there's instructions on how you can include that output in your Stack Exchange question. That'll save a whole lot of back and forth with people asking for more details.
You know, I'd probably also want to go to Idera and figure out exactly what that means. Because when you say something like memory gets pinned to the optimizer, I'm sort of baffled by like how memory gets pinned to the optimizer. Because the optimizer is not really something that memory gets pinned to. It will take a little bit of memory to compile a plan, but it's not a memory sucking
total
object.
hog.
Yeah.
All right, and then the last one we'll take, Rowdy says, I've been working on getting intended executions plans published to our development team. One of the things I found when I was exporting execution plans from cache is that some of my procedures have multiple plans in cache. Why would a procedure have multiple plans inside the cache?
Lots of reasons.
Like?
So many reasons. Different white space, different things getting passed in. God, there are so many. I'm trying to think of a good one, though. Trying to think of
my favorite good one is, so say you have the same stored procedure and it's called by, say one is by SSMS and one is by your app server. If you have different ANSI null options, arith abort settings in your anything about your session, you'll end up getting different execution plans cached.
If you have the same execution, if you have the same stored procedure in multiple databases, you'll have different ones.
Even if it's the same procedure in the same database, if you call it from different databases, you'll get it. If you call it fully qualified from, say, TempDB and master and a user database, you'll get it. And the epic blog post on this is slow in the app, fast in SSMS. This comes up at least once at every office hours. And frankly, I would say, folks, anytime you're troubleshooting any kind of issue with SQL Server, whether it's a failing cluster, always on availability groups broken, 2005 no longer under support, or a query performance problem, you should start with Erland Summerskog's excellent post, slow in the app, fast in SSMS. And if you Google for that, it's about 50 pages long, has a table of contents, but it makes your hair fuller, it brightens your skin. It's
a testosterone booster. It's everything.
Yes.
It's amazing.
Makes grown men cry. Makes young men cry. Makes women laugh. Yes. All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out with us this week at Office Hours, and we will see you guys next week. Adios.
Can I go back to Postgres now, please?
You can go back to Postgres now.
Get
Thank
out.
you.